back to another edition of Higher Education Today. I'm your host, Steven Roy Goodman. I'm here at the University of Cape Town, where we're going to be speaking about rural South Africa. Joyene Isaacs is head of the Department of Agriculture at the Western Cape government. Michael Bennish is executive director of the NGO Mpilonhle, which is located in KwaZulu-Natal. Welcome to both of you.
Thank you very much.
Nice to be here.
Well, thank you both for coming on the show. Joyene, maybe if we could start with you. So you're involved in the Western Cape government, but you're in a place called Elsenburg, which is not in downtown Cape Town. Can you describe a little bit about where you are and how that's different from Cape Town?
The department is situated on a farm outside Stellenbosch. Now, if you have a problem with directions, you get off at Cape Town Airport, you drive about 43 kilometers towards the mountains, and you will find Elsenburg nestled amongst the farming community. In fact, when I look out my window, I'm reminded that I'm dealing with agriculture every day. The department is in the Western Cape, which is one of 9 provinces in South Africa. We have a Mediterranean climate, which is very different to the rest of South Africa. We compare well to Spain and Portugal, so we can grow different crops. We have about 900 people, 52 offices, about 7 research farms to serve specifically the rural agriculture in the Western Cape.
And Michael, you work with the general public as well, but in a different part of South Africa.
Yeah, I do. And interestingly enough, Joyene had worked in the area that we're working now. It's also rural. But I think one point to emphasize perhaps is the heterogeneity within South Africa and within Africa. Africa is not a homogeneous entity. South Africa is not a homogeneous entity. There's great diversity. The area we work with is just below the Mozambique border. It's subtropical, as I said. We work mostly in what had been under apartheid designated as tribal homelands, right? Under the idea that it wasn't a unity South Africa, but certain areas were reserved for the black population, certain areas reserved for the white population. So we work what had been designated as a homeland. It's very different, but I must say, having been in South Africa for 17 years, I have to pinch myself to remind myself what first struck me. And what struck me when I first came is we work in a rural area that's not agricultural. And that is really a legacy of apartheid and what happened during apartheid, that large populations were moved in ways I think that might be unique almost in the history of the world, that people were displaced from areas they lived and just dumped into other areas. So it's a very unique spatial relationship. And I think the other thing to emphasize that I notice is, I think especially perhaps back in the States or in Europe, people have a concept of village structure for rural areas. Especially in KwaZulu-Natal, traditional settlement patterns were homesteads, not villages. It makes the challenges different in some ways than people might preconceive of them being.
Well, maybe we can talk about some of those challenges. Yeah. Perhaps we can talk about the challenges economically. Perhaps we can talk about the challenges health-wise. Can both of you maybe say a word or two about what those challenges might be?
What is interesting for the Western Cape, and I'm particularly focusing first on the Western Cape, is that for us, the biggest challenge is actually if you don't have water infrastructure, you can't practice agriculture either. So one of the restricting factors almost for agriculture, and this is not confined to only the Western Cape, in fact it is about the rest of the country. If you don't develop water infrastructure, but also telecommunication infrastructure, your economic opportunities are, especially for rural youth, is severely limiting. Not just for rural youth, I think it's for the rural people. Because if you think about agriculture's access to markets, it's about getting information for production. It's about getting the right extension information. And part of the problem is we are globally connected, and yet in rural areas our telecommunications infrastructure doesn't allow even South Africans to be connected. So that's the one thing. The second thing is despite making really inroads in terms of especially our education for young people as well, the perception, and this is a perception that agriculture carries because of a historical legacy of South Africa, that people see it as a punishment. They see it as not quite sexy enough. And therein lies probably a whole challenge locked for economic development, because agriculture is science. It's not actually just anybody doing it. And to change the mindset of young people in terms of education, but in terms of science and maths, is one of our biggest, as South Africa, our biggest challenge. Funny enough, 70% of our black people are studying today, up from 94. But it's hard to harness those skills to actually use it for economic opportunities. And agriculture offers one of it.
Yeah, just to pick up on some of the points that Joyene mentioned, when people come and visit us or come visit for the first time and they land here in Cape Town or in Durban or Joburg, I tell them that Cape Town and Durban are closer to Perth or Miami or San Diego than they are to Matuba and the areas we work in. And the areas we work in are closer to Africa. So there's this great gap, as you know, in terms of wealth and development that Joyene mentioned, access to IT and infrastructure that are in urban areas. Yet the rural areas still contain 35% of the country's population of a little bit over 50 million. And the question is, what's the future for those 35% of the population, which is about 20 million persons who are living in rural areas? What's the hope? Well, one of the things we see, and I think every visitor to South Africa, especially to Cape Town, notices when they arrive, they see large informal settlements, the condition of which, and whether it's Mitchell's Plain or Khayelitsha when they land here in Cape Town, are people who've moved from rural areas because there's no opportunity in rural areas. But those are a difficult transition that the government's still working on. There's a very good document out called the National Development Plan 2030 that grapples with issues of agriculture. But still, we know that over time, the rural population has done a decrease, as it is in all developing countries. South Africa is a higher middle income country. It has very well developed infrastructure in certain areas, has very well educated population that can lead in many areas, but there's still this 35% of the population that doesn't have access to many of the public goods that would enable them to take and grab a hold of the opportunities that a democratic society offers, right? So people have political rights. The question is, what is the nature of their economic and social rights? And that's slower to come about than political rights. And so those are some of the challenges. We work in health primarily, but one of the things we quickly saw is rural kids have no access to computers. So we started a computer program using Khan Academy, freeware, that they can learn math and science. A whole host of challenges in health and access to services and access to education that need to be addressed.
Well, Michael, given that you have an accent that's a little bit like mine,
Yeah.
Can you bring an American viewer here for a moment and explain how is rural South Africa different or similar to rural parts of the United States?
Well, don't forget, in the U.S., the rural population is really 2%. Agriculture is 2% of the population. In a country like South Africa, it's 35%. So people don't have, some of the challenges are quite similar, though, for rural populations that are left behind. Access to health care. We know in the States, people complain because rural hospitals close, they have to go long distances. People that we work with in those communities, they might have to go 10 or 15 miles to access health care. Schools are distant. IT access, as Joyene mentioned. People don't invest in rural areas in IT because the profitability, the density of population is not there. But in addition to that, and I think Joyene mentioned an important issue, is because of the apartheid legacy, people were dumped into areas, literally dumped into areas, picked up and put and moved. And it's still one of the most striking things when you go to places outside of Kruger, Bushbuck Ridge and other areas. There's these basically urban slums that were transported to rural areas. what do they do over the long term in terms of where they go? And one of the big issues that Joyene mentioned, and you see it when you arrive in Cape Town, is conserve water. And I was just Friday and Monday, I was out at the rural schools we work with. The roads were lined with buckets waiting for the water truck to come by. You can't really have a rural population that doesn't have access to water. And I think Jared Diamond and Jeff Sachs and other people who write sort of at the meta level about development have always made the point that Africa's development is hampered in some degree by the inconsistencies of rain and the access to water. So the National Development Plan makes the point that agriculture in South Africa has to be irrigation-based. But now we're facing a whole new set of challenges from global warming, changes in climate, access to water. That is more severe in Southern Africa because we know that historically rains have been inconsistent. Agriculture really has to be based on, in South Africa, on access to water and irrigation. You can't depend on rains to regularly provide sustenance. But it also does mean that people who were picked up in apartheid and moved into rural areas and didn't have access to urban areas, we need to look at that transition. Now, the government has made a big effort in terms of putting in some degree of infrastructure, putting in roads, trying to support schools, trying to support healthcare facilities. But the economic base for the area that I work in, 70% unemployment, right? Depending on government grants, right? The government transfers. But it is a major challenge and a major issue, that and water.
And do you agree with that?
Actually, at the moment, the Western Cape province has a severe drought. If we do not get 50% of our dams filled by the end of August, we're going to go into severe water restrictions. I believe it's a combination of obviously climate change. It is a growing population because our constitution was actually quite forward thinking. It says water for people first, then water for the environment, and only third is water for industrial development. So if water is under pressure, the agricultural sector actually loses because the water has to go to people. And so we need to both, from a technology innovation perspective, look at water to use less, but probably produce more, because a part of that water will go for the inner city.
If you don't mind me following up on that, because that's an interesting point, because you're essentially pitting one citizen versus another citizen about water issues, if I understood you correctly.
Actually, the Constitution has defined it. The Constitution says people will always have to get water. So what you have de facto is you have the citizens of South Africa, in terms of our Constitution, is guaranteed water before anybody else, even nature. I'm almost caught between a rock and a hard place. So people need to get water, agriculture needs water, but we need the water and agriculture to create jobs. If we do not create jobs, we can't earn foreign earnings because we can't export our produce because it's not big enough, it doesn't conform, and it means less people get employment. As the water dries up, the agricultural economic opportunities also dry up. So people are on farms, and if they don't have a job, where are they going to go? They're going to go to the town. So the more people is in the town, the more water demand, the less for agriculture. And it's a real dilemma at the moment because the Constitution dictates how I need to behave.
That is interesting because I imagine this is not just in the Western Cape. I imagine this is also in KwaZulu-Natal and other rural areas throughout the country.
And around the world. I mean, we see this competition between agriculture and human use in other areas, other countries, other states within the United States. There's a real tension there. And it's exacerbated in South Africa because of the legacy of what's happened. Just in our area, for instance, the main road that goes through is the N2, Rains and water are good to the east of the N2, between the N2 and the Indian Ocean, which is semi-tropical.
Yeah.
Big sugarcane farms, lots of irrigation. As soon as you cross the N2, which was under apartheid designated as an area of Bantustan for black persons to live, poor rains, no irrigation. So how do you deal with those spatial settlements over the long term? Very, very big challenge. But it might be that water in some ways is our biggest challenge of the 21st century in terms of how we do water. And in the rural South Africa, in the homestead pattern instead of the village pattern, having piped water to these settlements that might be, someone might live here, someone might live half a mile away, the expense and support to sustain piped water is really prohibitive. So you have to look at other things, and it's really a real challenge of what's going to happen over the long term. It's a real political decision that has to be made of how you structure that development challenge, which is being addressed very well. Let me point to some positive things that Joyene mentioned as well. I mean, the government is doing some very positive things. So we work with the Department of Science and Technology, for instance, to support solar installations to maintain computer labs in rural schools, right? Because power is inconsistent, again, because of the nature of the grid and sustaining that. So they've been very supportive of both the solar panel industry in South Africa and putting those into school, which gets to one of the things that Joyene mentioned, access to computers and using computers, which are essential for the next generation to be able to succeed. So I think they're very thoughtful. They have a very thoughtful program. One thing South Africa does have, even though it's a rainy day outside today, is lots of sun. So South Africa is making big strides in solar power, in wind power, looking at wave power. So there are many things that are positive as well that are happening that I think are innovative. Joyene works with this more, but we see the effect. They're also working to get previously disadvantaged persons into small shareholdings because there hasn't really been subsistence agriculture as a result, again, of the legacy and the history of the country, but at least to get people into areas where they can subside and make a decent income and not have to come live in a slum in a peri-urban area. So I think there are some bright spots as well. It's important that the challenges have been recognized. I think that's done through a number of ways, but also that solutions are out there, and there are solutions that are happening.
Well, and speaking of those solutions, from where I'm sitting, this seems to be quite a challenge because if there's simply not enough water, everything falls apart.
Well, actually, yes and no. Look, South Africans generally has an attitude. We're going to make a plan. And so what we've done in the department, we've realized that climate change is going to affect rain and the patterns of rain. Yes, and we do rely on extensive production for our wheat. So rain must be consistent, which it's not going to be. So what we've done is we've invested in what we call alternative crops. Now, alternative crops hasn't quite hit the mark in terms of a normal commodity like apples. So we're investing in the basics, and we're saying to farmers, what are those basics you need? We will pay for the research. But you know, government is red tape as well. So we said to them, we're not going to have contracts. You're going to have contracts with institutions that can do this research so that we can apply it, so that we can reduce the risk for farmers. So we've looked at pomegranates, figs, prickly pear, all those crops that you can grow with less water, but your labor requirement is more. Because we understand we have a massive labor pool that we need to utilize and we need to create jobs. So yes, mechanization is going to happen in the commodities, but in alternative crops, because it's niche, you can actually create pockets where more people can be employed. So that's just one way of looking at it and actually coming up with a solution. The other is we are actually using satellite technology, where we're flying it over commodity areas, and we're advising farmers where they don't need to irrigate because the soil is moist enough. And in fact, every year for the last 5 years, we've seen an increase of farmers joining this club so that they can start using less and less water. And it means they can keep their allocation of water from the dams, but they can actually plant more and long-term keep it going. So we're seeing farmers with us looking at solutions of using less water. But the other one is I've been talking to my department saying, guys, we need to lead by using less water. So obviously, in a silly way, we said, oh, well, maybe we should shower together, maybe, we shouldn't wash it all. But what we did is we've actually gone and bought 60 water tanks, 2 liters, and placed it in the government departments and said, let's start at home. So that when people get there, they can see we're not just talking about it, we're doing it. Also, we have said, if you want to grow a garden in this Western Cape, you will not use drinking water. You will recycle your water for gardens. So you can eat, but you can use your water twice, if not thrice. So those are the messages we've sent out as well. And the most amazing is we see about 9, sometimes 10,000 kids that we train on land care principles, how to look after the soil, how to look after water, because we do believe, and education and research has shown, that if you reach a young child at the age of anything between 9 and 11, and you talk about environmental issues or any issue, it will stay with them. And that's what we're doing as well. So long term we build.
I just want to pick up on, again, something Joyene said. One of the first phrases, Joyene said it in English, but one of the first phrases I learned when I came to South Africa is, a boer maak 'n plan. A farmer makes a plan. And people in rural areas are adaptable in ways that I could never be adaptable. So for instance, the children at the schools we work with, uniforms are mandatory in schools in South Africa, but they come with starched, pressed, clean clothes. Now how they do it in rural areas without electricity or heating an iron on fire, but they really are able to adapt and find solutions. And I do find encouraging the buildings we've built and the offices and the schools we work with make use of gray water, as Joyene mentioned, how to recycle water, how to minimize your water. So I do think there are many approaches that South Africa is really self-sufficient and leading the world in some ways. So I think there's optimism for how to adapt it. Now, that having said, I just say that I want to come back to the spatial relationships. The development plan looks at creating 1 million new agricultural jobs. But there currently, of the 17 million people living in rural areas, there are probably 8 or 10 million unemployed people, right? So the transition has to be to more rational use of urban areas as well. Decrease, again, as a legacy of apartheid, because black persons and non-whites had to live far away from where the jobs were. All these demands on petrol, on transport. So that is a major challenge of how we urbanize in an intelligent way to minimize the resources and use water and power effectively. It's a transition. It's a country in transition. Many countries have gone through that, and challenges, but hope as well.
Well, in terms of the challenges and hope, Joyene, anything else that you want to add about challenges and hope before we say goodbye today?
Well, I think we have quite an innovative initiative that we are targeting young people on farms. And we are going to the owners and saying, how about you being the mentors for these youngsters? And so we pay them a stipend, they become a learner or they join a learnership program. But what it allows them to do is build credits. And last year, we had a number of those agri-worker students graduating from the college at my department. And they are saying, now nothing is going to stop us. And I think that is, if we can have more of those, we're going to go a long way.
Well, thank you both, and especially thank you for sharing the old adage about making a plan. If you would like additional information about Joyene Isaacs or Michael Bennish, please visit elsenburg.com or Mpilonhle.org. If you have comments or suggestions about Higher Education Today, please send an email to our viewer mailbox at highereducationtoday@topcolleges.com. And thank you for watching. We will continue to bring you quality discussions about important matters in today's college and university world. I'm Steven Roy Goodman, and you've been watching Higher Education Today.